The grandfather clock in Gatcombe Park's entrance hall chimed 4 times as Princess Anne made her way down the darkened staircase. The October morning air carried an unusual chill that seemed to seep through the stone walls of her Gloucestershire home. She had been awake for nearly an hour, unable to shake the restless feeling that had pulled her from sleep. Anne wrapped her dressing gown tighter around her shoulders as she walked toward the kitchen. At 53, the Princess Royal had learned to trust her instincts, and something felt different about this morning. The horses in the nearby stables were unusually quiet, and even her beloved dogs seemed subdued as they followed her through the corridors. The telephone's shrill ring cut through the silence like a blade. Anne paused, her hand hovering over the kettle she had been filling. Phone calls at this hour rarely brought good news, especially to members of the royal family. She set the kettle down and walked toward the study where the secure line was located. "Your Royal Highness, this is Sir Robert Fellows from Buckingham Palace." The private secretary's voice was strained, carrying a weight that immediately set Anne's nerves on edge. She had known Robert for years, and she had never heard him sound quite like this. "Robert, what's happened?" Anne's voice remained steady, though her grip tightened on the receiver. Years of royal training had taught her to maintain composure even when her heart began to race. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I have some very serious news. There's been an accident in Paris." The pause that followed seemed to stretch endlessly. "It involves the Princess of Wales." Anne felt the world tilt slightly. Diana. Despite their complicated relationship over the years, despite the tensions and disagreements that had sometimes divided the family, Diana remained the mother of her nephews, William and Harry. "How serious, Robert?" "I'm afraid it's very serious indeed, Your Royal Highness. The princess was in a car accident in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. She was with Mr. Al-Fayed and their driver. The vehicle crashed at high speed while being pursued by photographers." Anne sank into the leather chair behind the mahogany desk. The study, usually her sanctuary filled with photographs of her equestrian achievements and family memories, suddenly felt suffocating. "Are they all right?" The silence on the other end told her everything she needed to know before Robert spoke again. "Mr. Al-Fayed and the driver were killed instantly, ma'am. The princess was rushed to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, but—" His voice broke slightly. "I'm very sorry to inform you that the Princess of Wales died from her injuries approximately 30 minutes ago." The words hit Anne like a physical blow. She stared at the family photograph on her desk, one taken just months earlier at a royal function where Diana had looked radiant, laughing at something Prince Charles had said. The image seemed surreal now, frozen in time, while the world had suddenly changed forever. "The boys," Anne said quietly, her first thought going to her teenage nephews who were at Balmoral with their father and grandmother. "Do William and Harry know?" "The Queen has asked that we wait until morning to inform them. His Royal Highness is driving up from London as we speak. Your mother felt it would be better for the boys to hear this from their father in person rather than being woken in the middle of the night." Anne nodded, even though Robert couldn't see her. It was a decision that showed the Queen's wisdom and her deep understanding of human nature, even in the midst of crisis. "What about the press?" "We're expecting the story to break within the hour. The palace is preparing a statement, and we're coordinating with the French authorities. Ma'am, the Queen has requested that all senior members of the family remain available for consultation throughout the morning." Anne looked out the window toward the east, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky. In just a few hours, the entire world would know that the people's princess was gone. The woman who had captured hearts globally, who had revolutionized the royal family's approach to public service, who had brought such joy and such complication into their lives, was dead at 36. "I'll be ready," Anne said simply. "Is there anything else I should know right now?" The circumstances of the accident are still being investigated, but early reports suggest the driver may have been intoxicated and that the paparazzi were indeed pursuing them aggressively. There will undoubtedly be questions about security arrangements and the decision to travel without protection officers. Anne felt a familiar surge of anger at the mention of the paparazzi. Throughout her own life, she had maintained a contentious relationship with the press, often refusing to cooperate with photographers and journalists who seemed to treat the royal family as entertainment rather than people. Diana's relationship with the media had been far more complex, sometimes embracing the attention, other times suffering terribly because of it. The funeral arrangements, Anne began. Nothing has been decided yet, ma'am. Given the princess's popularity and the circumstances of her death, this will likely be unprecedented in terms of public reaction. The palace is preparing for significant public mourning and international attention. After ending the call, Anne remained sitting in the study as the sky continued to lighten outside. She thought about Diana's last public appearances, the work she had been doing with landmine victims, her newfound happiness with Dodi al-Fayed. The princess had seemed to be finding her way toward a new chapter in her life after the difficult years following her divorce from Charles. Anne rose and walked to the window, watching as the sun crested the horizon. Somewhere in Scotland, her nephews were sleeping peacefully, unaware that their lives had just changed forever. In London, Charles was racing north to be with his sons. At Balmoral, the Queen was probably sitting in her own study, weighing the enormous decisions that lay ahead. The Princess Royal had weathered many storms during her decades of royal duty. She had survived her own marriage difficulties, assassination attempts, and countless public scrutinies. But she knew instinctively that this morning marked the beginning of something unprecedented. Diana's death would not just be a family tragedy. It would be a seismic event that would shake the monarchy to its core. Anne picked up the secure phone again and dialed her brother Andrew's number. As the day progressed, the family would need to present a united front, and there would be countless decisions to make. But first, they needed to process their own grief and shock while simultaneously preparing for the public storm that was about to engulf them all. The letter she had been expecting from the palace would arrive before noon, outlining the immediate protocol and arrangements. But the real challenge would be navigating the unprecedented public mourning that was about to sweep not just Britain, but the entire world. Diana, even in death, would continue to challenge and change the royal family in ways none of them could yet imagine. By 9 o'clock that morning, Anne had dressed in a dark navy suit and was preparing to leave for London when the first wave of media attention reached Gatcombe Park. Through her bedroom window, she could see news vans beginning to gather at the estate's gates, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like mechanical flowers reaching for the sun. Her personal protection officer, Inspector Matthews, knocked on her door with an update that confirmed her worst fears. "Ma'am, the story broke internationally about an hour ago. The switchboard at the palace has been overwhelmed, and there are crowds beginning to gather outside Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace." Anne fastened her pearl earrings and turned from the mirror. "How large are the crowds?" "Already in the hundreds, ma'am, and growing rapidly. People are bringing flowers, and many appear to be genuinely distraught. The Metropolitan Police are requesting additional units for crowd control." The Princess Royal had witnessed public mourning before, but something in Matthew's tone suggested this was different. Diana had connected with people in a way that transcended traditional royal relationships. She had been photographed hugging AIDS patients when others feared to touch them, had walked through minefields to draw attention to the weapons' devastating effects on civilians, had been seen crying with bereaved mothers and laughing with sick children. Anne made her way downstairs to find her husband, Tim Lawrence, waiting by the front door with the official envelope that had arrived by courier from Buckingham Palace. The palace letterhead felt heavier than usual in her hands as she broke the royal seal. The message was brief, but comprehensive. All senior royals were to remain in close communication throughout the day. Charles had successfully reached Balmoral and was with William and Harry. The boys had been informed and were being comforted by their father and grandmother. A family meeting was scheduled for that evening to discuss funeral arrangements and the family's response to what was already being described as an unprecedented outpouring of public grief. "The Queen wants to see how this develops before making any major decisions," Anne told Tim as they climbed into the armored Bentley. "But from what I'm hearing, this isn't going to be a quiet, private family affair." As their car pulled away from Gatcombe Park, Anne could see reporters shouting questions and cameras flashing. The drive to London, normally a peaceful journey through the Cotswolds, became a surreal procession past groups of people who had already heard the news and were standing by the roadside, some weeping, others simply staring as the royal convoy passed. Tim reached over and squeezed her hand. "How are you holding up?" Anne considered the question carefully. Her relationship with Diana had been complex, marked by mutual respect, but also fundamental differences in how they approached royal duty. Diana's emotional openness, her willingness to share her struggles publicly, her intuitive connection with people's pain. These qualities had sometimes frustrated Anne, who believed in the traditional royal values of duty, discretion, and stoic service. "I keep thinking about the last time I saw her," Anne said quietly. "It was at the Trooping the Color ceremony in June. She looked genuinely happy for the first time in years. She was laughing with William about something, and Harry was trying to get her attention. She seemed to have found some peace." As they approached London, the scale of the public response became increasingly apparent. Radio reports described crowds gathering not just at royal residences, but also at the hospital in Paris, where Diana had died, outside the British Embassy in France, and at British consulates around the world. Celebrities, politicians, and ordinary people were all expressing shock and grief. Anne's phone rang continuously with calls from other members of the royal family, government ministers, and heads of state offering condolences. Each conversation reinforced the same message. This was not just a British story, but an international tragedy that would require careful handling. At Buckingham Palace, Anne was ushered immediately into the Queen's private study, where she found her mother looking older than her 71 years. The Queen had always prided herself on maintaining composure during crises, but the magnitude of what was unfolding was clearly taking its toll. "Anne, thank you for coming so quickly," the Queen said, gesturing toward the chair across from her desk. "I need your assessment of what we're dealing with." Through the study windows, Anne could see the crowds that had gathered in front of the palace. Even from this distance, she could hear the sound of collective grief. People crying, singing hymns, calling out Diana's name. The sight was both moving and unsettling. "Mother, I think we need to understand that Diana connected with people in a way that goes beyond traditional royal relationships," Anne said carefully. "Her death isn't just being seen as the loss of a member of our family. People feel like they've lost someone who understood their struggles, who represented hope and compassion in a world that often seems cold." The Queen nodded slowly. "The Prime Minister called an hour ago. Mr. Blair described her as the people's princess and said the country is in mourning. He's concerned about the public mood and wants to ensure our response matches the gravity of how people are feeling." Anne could hear the frustration in her mother's voice. The royal family had always prided itself on dignity, restraint, and private grief. The idea of public mourning on this scale, with its demands for visible emotion and public participation, challenged everything they had been taught about proper behavior during times of loss. "What about Charles and the boys?" Anne asked. "Charles is struggling. He's dealing with his own complicated feelings about Diana while trying to support William and Harry. The boys are devastated, of course, but they're also confused about what comes next. Harry especially seems lost." Anne thought about her 15-year-old nephew, who had inherited Diana's emotional openness along with her striking blue eyes. Harry had always been particularly close to his mother, and Diana's protective instincts toward her younger son had been fierce. "Have we heard from Margaret or Edward?" Anne asked, referring to her siblings. "Margaret is flying back from Italy. She's asked that we delay any major decisions until she arrives. Edward and Sophie are driving up from London. This is going to require all of us working together, Anne. The public pressure will be enormous." As if to emphasize the point, the sound of the crowd outside seemed to grow louder. Anne could see palace staff moving back and forth past the study windows, their usual calm efficiency replaced by something approaching urgency. "There's something else," the Queen continued. "We're receiving reports that some people are criticizing our response so far. There are questions about why we haven't returned to London immediately, why there's been no public statement from the family, why the flag over the palace isn't flying at half-mast." Anne felt her protective instincts toward her family surge. "We've had less than 12 hours to process this ourselves. Charles needed to be with his sons, and that was the right priority." "I agree completely," the Queen said, "but I'm learning that in situations like this, the public's emotional needs and our family's private grief don't always align. We may need to find ways to honor both." The afternoon stretched ahead of them, filled with meetings, phone calls, and decisions that would shape how the royal family navigated the most challenging period in its modern history. Outside, the crowds continued to grow, bringing flowers, candles, and their own overwhelming sense of loss for a woman who had touched their lives in ways the traditional monarchy was only beginning to understand. The evening family meeting at Buckingham Palace was unlike any Anne had ever attended. Charles had flown down from Balmoral, leaving William and Harry in the care of their grandmother and their uncle Andrew. The Prince of Wales looked exhausted, his usual composure cracked by grief and the weight of decisions that would affect his sons for the rest of their lives. Princess Margaret had returned from her holiday in Italy, her face drawn but her mind characteristically sharp. Prince Edward and his wife Sophie sat quietly, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what the family was facing. The Queen sat at the head of the mahogany table in the Chinese dining room, surrounded by her children as they confronted a crisis none of them had been trained to handle. "The crowds outside have tripled since this morning," the Queen began, her voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. "The Prime Minister estimates that over 10,000 people gathered at Kensington Palace today alone. The police are concerned about crowd control, and we're receiving reports of similar gatherings in cities across Britain and around the world." Charles cleared his throat, his voice hoarse from hours of difficult conversations with his sons. "William and Harry want to participate in whatever arrangements we make. They're old enough to understand the public nature of their mother's role, and they feel strongly about honoring her memory properly." Anne studied her brother's face. Charles had always carried himself with a particular kind of dignity, but tonight he looked like a man who had aged years in a single day. The complexity of his relationship with Diana, the bitter divorce proceedings, the public scrutiny of his personal life, all of it would now be examined again through the lens of tragedy. "What are they specifically asking for?" Margaret inquired, her tone gentle but practical. "They want to walk behind the coffin," Charles said quietly. "William especially feels that it's his duty as the elder son and future king. Harry is uncertain, but he doesn't want his brother to do it alone." The room fell silent. Anne could picture her nephews, 15 and 12 years old, walking behind their mother's coffin through the streets of London while millions watched. The image was both heartbreaking and deeply moving. "That would mean a public funeral," Edward observed, "not a private family service." The Queen nodded. "The government has already made it clear that they believe a state funeral is appropriate, given Diana's role and the public response, but that decision ultimately rests with us as her former family." Anne had been thinking about this question all day. A state funeral would mean Westminster Abbey, television coverage around the world, heads of state in attendance, and protocols that hadn't been used since Winston Churchill's death in 1965. It would also mean weeks of preparation, intense media scrutiny, and the challenge of balancing royal tradition with Diana's unique legacy. What did Diana want? Anne asked. Did she ever express any preferences about funeral arrangements? Charles shook his head. She was only 36. People that age don't typically think about such things. But I know she would want her sons to feel proud of how she was remembered. Sophie spoke up for the first time. The flowers outside Kensington Palace stretch for nearly a quarter mile. People are writing messages, bringing photographs, camping overnight just to be near the palace. I've never seen anything like it. Anne had driven past Kensington Palace on her way to the meeting, and the sight had stopped her cold. What had started as a modest memorial was becoming something unprecedented. A carpet of flowers, teddy bears, handwritten notes, and candles that transformed the formal palace grounds into something resembling a shrine. The international response is equally extraordinary, the Queen continued. President Clinton called personally. President Chirac has offered any assistance France can provide, and we're receiving condolence messages from leaders around the world. The Archbishop of Canterbury has cleared his schedule and is available for whatever arrangements we decide upon. Margaret leaned forward. What about the press arrangements? Diana's relationship with the media was complicated, but they'll certainly want extensive coverage of the funeral. Charles's jaw tightened. The same photographers who chased her car are now calling for access to cover her funeral. There's something deeply wrong with that. Anne felt her brother's anger and shared it completely. The irony of the media's role in Diana's death and their subsequent demand for access to her funeral was not lost on any of them. Yet they also knew that millions of people around the world would want to participate in honoring Diana's memory, and television coverage might be the only way to accommodate that desire. We need to think about what Diana represented to people, Anne said carefully. She changed how the royal family connects with the public. Her funeral might need to reflect that evolution. The Queen considered this statement. Are you suggesting we break with traditional protocol? I'm suggesting we consider what would honor Diana's legacy while supporting William and Harry, Anne replied. Diana brought emotional authenticity to royal duty. Perhaps her funeral should reflect that same authenticity. Edward nodded. The public response today shows that people don't just want to observe royal grief from a distance. They want to participate in it, to feel connected to it. Charles looked around the table at his family. Diana always said that she wanted to be the queen of people's hearts rather than a traditional queen. Perhaps her funeral should reflect that vision. As the evening wore on, the family began to outline the framework for what would become one of the most watched events in television history. Westminster Abbey would host the service, but the route would pass through central London so that ordinary people could line the streets. World leaders would be invited, but space would also be reserved for representatives of the charities Diana had supported. The decision about William and Harry walking behind the coffin remained difficult. Anne could see Charles wrestling with his protective instincts as a father against his understanding of his son's need to honor their mother publicly. What if they're not alone? Anne suggested. Philip could walk with them, and you, Charles. Perhaps I could join as well. They would be supported by family, but they could still participate in the way they feel is right. Charles looked up, hope flickering in his tired eyes. Would you do that, Anne? Of course, Anne replied without hesitation. Diana was family, and this is what family does. The Queen smiled for the first time that day. I think Diana would approve of that arrangement. She always valued family loyalty, even during the difficult times. As the meeting concluded near midnight, Anne felt the weight of the days ahead. There would be protocol meetings, security briefings, coordination with government officials, and the enormous challenge of organizing a funeral that would satisfy both royal tradition and public expectation. But more than that, there would be the personal challenge of saying goodbye to a woman who had fundamentally changed their family and the monarchy itself. Diana had brought chaos and joy, tradition and revolution, private pain and public inspiration. Her death would test everything the royal family thought they knew about duty, service, and their relationship with the people they served. Walking out of Buckingham Palace that night, Anne could hear the crowd that remained outside the gates. Even at this late hour, hundreds of people stood vigil, some singing hymns, others simply standing in silent tribute. The sight reminded her that this was no longer just about their family's private grief. Diana's death had become a moment of collective mourning that would require the royal family to evolve in ways they were only beginning to understand. The letter she had received that morning seemed like it had arrived weeks ago rather than hours. By the time Diana's funeral took place, Anne knew that both the royal family and Britain itself would be forever changed. The only question now was whether they could honor Diana's memory while finding a path forward that preserved the best of royal tradition while embracing the emotional authenticity that Diana had brought to public service.